Some news from the other side of the pond. It's been the Democratic National Convention, and this is the moment. I mean, she's been known as a candidate for ages. She's been on the campaign trail, but this was the moment that Kamala Harris officially accepted the Democratic nomination, and in that regard made her maiden speech. Now, it's funny. Oh, Kamala Harris, 1 minute ago, she wasn't particularly popular. People thought she had some pretty wacky, very left-wing ideas and that she was a bit rubbish and that she didn't really get where she got to by meritocracy. Well, what are you to now? Butter wouldn't melt in her mouth. She's the hope. She's the inspiration. She's the future. That's according to huge tranches of the American media. Anyway, huge tranches of our own media. I'm pretty appalled that the BBC, every time they seem to be talking about her running mate, keeps calling him Coach Walls. I'm like, you're not allowed to just go and, like, repeat the propaganda. You're supposed to be objective reporters. But interesting, if you go onto the Democratic website and try and find out what their policies are going to be, we're just 75 or 76 days away from that election in America, you won't find a single one. And is that because she's flipped-flopped on a lot of things? Well, either way, it seems to be working, because from what I can tell, the polls have definitely narrowed it, and it might be that she's in the lead. Let's speak to Eric Ham, who is a US political commentator. Hi, Eric. I mean, it seems to me that both sides of the pond, people are going a bit Kamala crazy.
That's true, they are. At least in the United States, many Democrats are certainly going that way. And I think one reason for that is because throughout this election cycle, before Joe Biden got out of the race, many voters simply did not want either of these candidates. They thought both men were too old, and they thought it was time to change the page and put someone younger in. With Kamala Harris, now she seems to embody a lot of what many voters wanted. And now what we're seeing is many of those voters are coming off of the sidelines and becoming more vested in this race.
I mean, is it the case that, you know, we're still going to have a split, that if you're a Republican, you're going to vote Republican, if you're Democrat, you're going to vote Democrat? Well, how influential are the swing states going to be, the floating voters, if you will, and how likely are they to be sucked up in Kamala mania?
Well, we're getting some indication of that right now. Again, when you go back to Trump and Biden, there was what we call double haters, people who did not like either of these candidates. And many of those candidates were actually, many of those voters were going to the third party candidate, Robert Kennedy Jr., who in some places was polling as high as 15%. And so now, since Kamala Harris has become the Democratic nominee, Robert Kennedy Jr.'s polling numbers have gone way, way down. In fact, he's making an announcement today here in the United States, and many believe that he's exiting the race and he's going to be endorsing Donald Trump. The reason, of course, for that is because much of that support, that double hate support for both Trump and Biden that went to Robert Kennedy Jr. is now going to Kamala Harris. And that's why we see Kamala Harris now leading in many of these key battleground states that will certainly determine the outcome of the race.
Which I'm just going to play a little clip, by the way, from her speech last night. Let's have a listen. I want to ask you a question off the back of it.
I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump. Because, you know, they know he is easy to manipulate with flattery and favors. They know Trump won't hold autocrats accountable because he wants to be an autocrat himself.
Do you know, Eric, it makes me really sad, upset and worried when I see stuff like that, because to British eyes and ears of, you know, people with a degree of pragmatism and sense, it sounds to me, you know, dangerous and cartoonish, reckless, in fact. I don't care for language such as he's an autocrat. When people say, oh, I hate Donald Trump, he's so evil, I'm like, well, he's already been president. Point to the evil for me, please. Point to what he did that was autocratic, because I think there's a lot that he did, or his team did, during those years, which were extremely clever moves, particularly internationally. He was a strong ally of Britain. He helped see all the Abraham Accords realised, which now you've got the despots in Iran trying to ruin all of that. And when I see stuff like that sort of two-dimensional good versus evil battleground coming out out of America. It just makes me really depressed that people aren't scrutinising actual policies. And yet, when you do look at some of Kamala Harris's previous policies, I think she's being forced to ditch at an alarming rate. They sound like the sort of stuff that once upon a time America was actively fighting against during the Cold War, and that she thinks could be just what America needs in the 21st century.
Well, I think America still stands in a place where we do stand for freedom. We do stand against despots and fascists. And there is this growing concern about Donald Trump and his tendencies to have an affinity to strongmen. In fact, we know in one of those battleground states, the state of Michigan, just recently, Donald Trump held a rally in a place where there were white supremacists who were supporting and actually comparing Donald Trump to Hitler, Nazi Germany. And so we have heard Donald Trump say that if he actually returns to the White House, he will institute a Third Reich-like administration. And so these are just some of the things that we hear from Donald Trump that does give people pause. And of course, we know from our own U.S. intelligence sources that say that entities like China, North Korea, Russia are trying to influence the outcome of this election, including Iran as well. And so there is growing concern about what impact these types of influences are having on the United States, right. And there's every right to be worried.
Yeah, I want to pick up that particular point with Dr. Alan Mendoza, who really is one of the UK's leading experts in this stuff. Now, we know actually that Iran, of course, they're trying to influence the elections. They've been trying to hack into the Republican databases. Now, when you look at Trump's history on dealing with Iran, he was the one who basically said, we got to stop, as far as I can tell, and you're the expert, we got to stop pandering to them. Yep. You know, we can't say to them, oh, we're going to lift the sanctions. You can't trust them. And actually, it's under Biden that all of the mess around the world has taken place, that Putin's invaded Ukraine, that Iran is, you know, getting all of its proxies to launch attacks against the West and Western allies. So in your opinion, when it comes to if there was foreign interference in elections, it is all over the world. My feeling is that Iran would probably far rather Kamala Harris was sitting in the White House.
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case because, you know, Kamala Harris has been part of the Biden-Harris administration. I've not seen any suggestion she's diverged from him on foreign policy, except perhaps to go even more left on foreign policy to where he has gone. And the Iran policy under Biden's been an absolute failure. Iran has gotten closer and closer to a nuclear weapon status, having been given tons of money by the US and by ourselves as well. And there have been no sanctions put on it. It's just, you know, inexorably getting closer, able to interfere in the region, and with very little comeback. So, yes, I think they'd be terrified of Trump, given what Trump did in the first term. Don't forget, he didn't just threaten their nuclear program. He also took out their terrorist-in-chief, Qasem Soleimani, by assassinating him in January of 2020, which was a huge blow to their operational capabilities. So they know Trump's got their number.
Now, what about what Eric was saying, and more like what Kamala Harris was saying, is, oh, Trump likes to cozy up to autocrats because he would be an autocrat himself. I mean, is there anything to fear? I mean, Eric was saying he's been perhaps cynically and deliberately hosting rallies in certain areas where they are sort of comparing him to Hitler. That's not exactly a comparison you want to happen.
No.
And, you know, he said, I'm going to run the, you know, administration like the Third Reich. Again, probably words that you should not be using. Are there alarm bells when it comes to Donald Trump?
Well, look, I think the biggest alarm bell with Donald Trump was, of course, January the 6th of 2021, when, you know, he was essentially responsible for that insurrection. Okay, he didn't go out and do it himself, but he, you know, gave it the nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and that's not something you would expect from the, you know, former executive-in-chief, still executive at the time, of the world's, you know, leading democracy. That's just nonsense. So I think there are, of course, fears, but I think what people have failed to, you know, look at is that the system held in January of 2021, held very well, actually. He was, you know, marshalled out of office. The people did the jobs they were supposed to do. They didn't cave to the pressure. The judicial system worked in its way as well. And that would happen again. All this nonsense talk about this is just for his supporters. I think the other interesting thing to note is that a while ago, Vladimir Putin let out that actually It's Trump's unpredictability they fear more than, say, Biden's Russia policy. You don't know what you get with Trump. One minute you can say, oh, he's your friend. The next minute he can be your worst enemy. And I don't think Putin likes people like that. And for all this talk of him being a Russian stooge, I think there are people around Trump who perfectly understand that Russia is an enemy. And he himself perfectly understands that Vladimir Putin is not going to be a negotiating partner for him, but is likely to annoy him rather than the other way around. Yeah,
I mean, Eric, it's interesting. That is the view from this side of the pond, from Dr. Mendoza, who runs the UK's leading foreign affairs think tank. It's an Anglo-American think tank named after your Henry Jackson. And so we do have certain fears over here that Kamala isn't getting enough scrutiny. She's sort of doing the light and shade. She's doing I'm going to do loudspeaker speaking to the Obamas on my mobile phone. I'm positive, I'm wonderful, it's Coach Waltz. And we're like, come on, you're an important country. And what you do and who's the leader of your country actually affects all of us. Are we going to hopefully start seeing, as we get closer to the election date, the campaign start taking a more political turn in terms of looking at policies and getting an idea of what might happen, whoever becomes the next president of America?
That has certainly been a criticism of many in the press, that they want to see a more substantive policy shop from the Kamala campaign, and they're not seeing or getting that right now. But I think we have seen in the United States, we have seen white paper after white paper from Hillary Clinton and Elizabeth Warren, and that simply did not work for voters. And I think right now what voters want is voters want to be inspired, and voters want to they want to feel like they believe that who they have at the wheel is someone that they can trust and they can count on. And right now, based on what the polling data is showing and saying, is they trust Kamala Harris more than they do Donald Trump.
Eric, it's been brilliant to get your observations on this. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Let's catch up again soon.